Good evening and welcome. My name is Ariel Kimbleton and I work with Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning. This summer, Summer Sessions has been organizing events for Monday through Thursday during the week. They have lectures, movies, and concerts organized just for the community members of Fairbanks to enjoy. Tonight we continue with the Discover Alaska lecture series. Each year, professionals from various departments on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus join us for an evening presentation on topics relating to Alaska. Tonight, we are honored to have Dr. Barbara Taylor joining us. Dr. Taylor is an associate professor of biology in neuroscience and director of undergraduate research and scholarly activity at UAF. She completed her MS and PhD in zoology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Following her postdoctoral positions at the University of Calgary and Dartmouth Medical School, she moved to UAF in 2003. So she's been here for 10 years. Her research interests include the mechanisms by which environmental agents influence the brain function, and she has 2 research programs based on this interest. At the end of her lecture tonight, we will open the floor for questions. Also, we will have free ice cream in the lobby, so that'll be great for the All right, and now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara Taylor.
Thank you, Ariel, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. As Ariel said, I am a neuroscientist. I'm actually lucky enough to be one of the researchers moving into this building. So my lab is the back on this floor, and I share that lab space with a number of other people. So I'm excited about that. Don't say go away. And what I want to tell you about tonight is a relatively new research area for my lab. We've been investigating neuroaging and neurodegeneration for about the last 2 years. I became interested actually in the model organism that we use because it seemed like such a great tool for getting students involved in research. But I got more and more interested in the neurodegeneration and neuroaging part of it, and actually all of our interest is focused around validating the effectiveness of folk medicines that are traditionally used in Alaska. And so what I'll tell you tonight is what we've learned so far about Alaskan folk medicines. It'll be a mixture of our own research and research done by others. And let's see if I know how to work the lights. No, I have.
Oh, that's good.
There you go. All right, so title of my talk, Alaskan Brain Food, What to Eat to Slow Aging and Neurodegeneration. Aging is arguably the most familiar and yet least well understood part of human biology. And human populations have been seeking some kind of antidote to aging for centuries, as is evident from the 16th century painting of the Fountain of Youth. But what is aging? Before we can counteract aging, we really need to understand what it is. And it's familiar to us all. We've all seen this progression that humans and other organisms go through their lifetime. But really, what's a definition? We need a definition of aging. So I went to Wikipedia, the source of all knowledge, and looked up aging. And it says that aging is a progressive deterioration of physiological function. Now, if you were hoping for a more educated kind of approach, I also looked up a review article by a world-renowned expert on aging research. This is Thomas Kirkwood, Dr. Thomas Kirkwood. And he published a review on aging research in the journal Cell, which is arguably the most notable biology publication, a very prestigious journal. And his definition is that aging is a progressive, generalized impairment of function resulting in increased vulnerability to environmental challenge and increased risk of disease and death. Okay, it's a progressive deterioration, right? Wikipedia was fine. But what causes aging? If it's this progressive deterioration, why? Why do we deteriorate? I mean, why do we have to? We are living creatures, and we all know that cells have ways of producing new materials. Cells can divide and reproduce themselves. I mean, there are animals that can regenerate limbs, okay, not mammals, but frogs and salamanders. So why do we have to age? And there are more than 300 theories to explain aging. And none of them completely sit well with everyone, okay? And I'm just going to pull out the top three, sort of the three most popular. Don't worry, I'm not going through all 300. So the first idea is this theory of programmed senescence. And the idea is that the older individuals in a population, they're the worn out ones, and they're not as good as the younger individuals. So why would you want the resources of the environment going to those older individuals? And so it would actually be beneficial to the population from a biological standpoint. It would be adaptive to the population if we actually had some genetically programmed self-removal process, a programmed senescence. The problem with that theory, though, is that in nature, very few organisms live to old age. Okay, in the human population we do, but if we're just looking from a biological perspective, predation and disease take most organisms out of the game long before they age into their twilight years, so to speak. So, there wouldn't be an opportunity to develop this programmed senescence. Another popular theory is that mutations accumulate over a lifetime, that damage is done by certain environmental agents, and that damage affects our DNA, our genetic code. That's the blueprint for all our cellular functions and structures, and that we just accumulate mutations over time. And another very popular theory, and this one actually is from Dr. Kirkwood, is the idea of the disposable soma. And it ties in this idea that most organisms don't live long enough to get to old age. When we're talking about a biological, humans, yes, but other organisms. And so the cost of maintaining and repairing all the structures that make up an organism's body isn't worth it. It's not worth maintaining all of this infrastructure because they're not going to live that long anyway. They only need to live long enough to reproduce from a sort of biological evolutionary sense.
What is soma, please?
Soma is body, just a word for body. So it means the disposable body theory. Thank you, I should have said that. So those are some popular theories, but they really all boil down to this idea that aging is caused by a deferred maintenance. I have to just be quiet for a minute, because if you say deferred maintenance on this campus, the thought police come for you. But really, that's what we're talking about, a deferred maintenance at a cellular level that lets random cellular and molecular damage accumulate. And as those damaged parts accumulate, then dysfunction ensues. So really, aging is something that takes place at a cellular level. So if you'll indulge me, I'll give you a little primer, a little refresher course on cells. These are the construction units of all living organisms. Okay, they're bounded by this lipid membrane, and they have all sorts of interesting and intricate moving parts inside. And there are specific members of that concert of moving parts that are particularly vulnerable to damage. Now, that's cells in general. What about this idea of neurodegeneration? Why is neural aging the aspect of aging that we focus on? The reason for that is the neurons you're born with are the only neurons you're ever going to have. There are just a couple of areas in the brain where new neurons are made. And so if you have an accumulation of damage due to deferred maintenance in neurons, that's where you're going to see the dysfunction most rapidly, because it's just going to accumulate over a lifetime. If you have other damage of cells in other tissues of the body, your skin cells are always replacing themselves, okay? And most of the other tissues in your body have the ability to replace. Some not as quick as your skin does, but those cells can be replaced. So the deferred maintenance aging damage is not as big an issue for other tissues in the body. But in the nervous system, in the brain, it absolutely is. And then we've got this accumulation of damage that we don't have a good way to deal with in the system that controls the whole body. And so damage to that system is going to impair all other systems. So that's why discussions of aging very rapidly move into discussions of neurodegeneration. So let's go back to this cell and look at some of these specific parts that are vulnerable to damage. The first one I'm going to pull up for you is the nucleus, which is sort of the control center of the cell. And inside the nucleus is where the chromosomes reside. And this is your DNA. This is your genetic code. This is the genetic blueprint for every cell. It's the blueprint for every structure and every function that goes on in the cell. And to read that blueprint, we have to unwind that DNA a little bit, and then we kind of expose it and make it vulnerable. And so that's why it's vulnerable to damage, and it's so critical as a blueprint that its damage is felt very drastically. Telomeres are specialized end caps on the end of the chromosome, and since the way the chromosome and reading that blueprint works, where you have to sort of uncoil things and read the code, and then you have to recompress it, there's a lot of unwinding and winding up going on. The telomeres protect the integrity of the chromosome during all of that unwinding and winding up. And so if you damage these end caps that are protecting the chromosome in general, that is quite devastating to the cell. Another cell part I'm going to pull up for you is the mitochondria. Okay? This is often referred to as the energy powerhouse of the cell. This is where most of the metabolic reactions that are responsible for extracting energy from food or storing energy, that's where they go on, in the mitochondria. And the mitochondria have a small amount of their own DNA, so they are somewhat vulnerable because all DNA, all of this precious genetic blueprint is vulnerable to damage. Another element to pull up is the protein factories inside cells. So proteins are made in ribosomes, which are represented as these little balls on this larger structure. Proteins are made there, and then they go straight into that larger structure. That's called the endoplasmic reticulum. It's just all part of the protein factory. But it's in that endoplasmic reticulum that they get folded into their proper functional structure. Proteins have to be the right shape to do the right job. And sometimes they also need a little chemical modification, a little addition or a little deletion to make them function ideally. And that happens in another part of the cell that's pictured in green over here, the Golgi apparatus. So the ribosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, that's all the protein factories of the cell. And if your protein factories aren't working properly, then the proteins that they produce are going to be altered and perhaps dysfunctional. And that could lead to cellular damage. Another part to pull up are these elements, which are this here called the proteasome, and then the little blue spear is a lysosome. And the proteasome and the lysosome can expand and engulf things, so it can get a lot bigger than it's pictured here. But the proteasome and the lysosome, those are the garbage disposal units in the cell. So if you have damaged parts, if you have dysfunctional proteins, it's going to be the job of proteasomes and lysosomes to get rid of that. And so if they're not working properly, if they have sustained any damage, then you're going to get a buildup of waste material in the cell, a waste accumulation. And that's going to negatively impact the function of the cell. So all of those spots inside the cell are the vulnerable spots to damage. But we still haven't got to the heart of the issue. What causes that damage? Okay? What is actually damaging the components of the cell? Because that's really what's causing aging. Well, there are two main things: radiation and oxidation. Radiation is like X-rays or ultraviolet radiation from the sun or radiation from a nuclear reactor that's gone into meltdown. That's a, thankfully, very rare experience, but that would be an example of radiation. Heat, extreme heat in some cases, would qualify as an example of radiation. Radiation is really a blast of intense energy that can do damage. And radiation isn't all that common in our environment, apart from the ultraviolet radiation that we get from the sun, which, as human beings, we have a number of behavioral ways to avoid. Oxidation is a little bit different. Oxidation, if radiation is like a giant blast of intense energy, then oxidation is like a blast of energy at an atomic or a molecular level. Basically, oxidation means that the electrons within the molecules inside the cells are going where they're not supposed to go. And that influences the way that those molecules can function inside cells. So what causes oxidation? Well, oxidative stress you might have heard of, or oxidation is caused by reactive oxygen species. This is oxygen that's carrying extra electrons and helping to move them around to places they're not supposed to be. Well, those reactive oxygen species, those are the culprits for oxidation. They're a byproduct of the cell undergoing its metabolism. They're basically the cost of doing business for the cell, and they are unavoidable. You cannot extinguish reactive oxygen species completely. But that might not be a good thing, and so let's investigate that a little bit more. But first, if we now know what causes aging, how can we fix it? Okay? If we can't eliminate all of it, how can we eliminate some of it and fix the damage that's done? So how can we avoid some of the damage? Well, if you reduce the metabolic rate, you reduce the rate at which these reactive oxygen species are made inside the cells. And that will reduce the amount of oxidation that's going on inside the cell. So one way to reduce the metabolic rate, and one that researchers have been chasing after for about 30 years now, is caloric restriction, reducing the number of calories that are taken in with the diet. And what we have here is a graph, the lifespan of mice. And I'm going to show you a few of these lifespan graphs, so I'll walk you through one here. We start off with a newborn population, everybody's alive, so 100% survival. And then as time passes and as aging happens, we lose members of that population. Okay? And so the percent surviving goes down over time until you reach the end of the natural lifespan. And so here, for mice that were not calorie restricted, their average lifespan is about 35 months, 36 months, 3 years. Okay? But if we reduce their caloric intake by 25%, by 55%, or by 65%, we push that lifespan curve out. They live longer, but even better than living longer, my husband says to me, I don't want to live 10 years longer if it's just going to be the crappy years at the end. Okay? They're not the, look, they're the good years up here when you're still quite young. Okay? So that's sometimes what people talk about, the difference between lifespan and health span. Okay? For how long are you healthy, hale and hearty and out living life to its fullest? So we have evidence that reducing caloric intake will extend lifespan. So back to the title, what should you eat to slow aging and neurodegeneration? It looks like the answer is less. I don't like that answer. And so I investigated caloric restriction a bit more, and I found, some people that were poking holes in that line of research and some controversy and some naysayers about the whole caloric restriction idea. And I was sort of happy to join their team because then I get to go out and eat ice cream when this is over, right? So before we invoke this very harsh advice about eating less, is there something else that we could do to avoid some of the damage due to aging and oxidation, or to repair some of it? This is where the anti-aging botanicals comes in. And probably most of you have heard of antioxidants. It's becoming a very common word in our vernacular. So antioxidants are chemicals that have the power to scavenge those reactive oxygen species, to take them out of the game before they can cause oxidative damage. And you have these in all your cells. I have them, you have them, all animals have them. Things like SOD up there, that stands for superoxide dismutase, glutathione, and catalase. Those are enzymes that can deal with reactive oxygen species. So we have antioxidants. Our cells are already doing some of this avoidance and repair. But plant cells are endowed with extra antioxidants. They have a whole other suite of chemicals that act as antioxidants. And if they act as antioxidants in the plant cells, they'll act as antioxidants in our cells. So as long as it's safe to consume the plant, that plant has benefits for us. And so I have some sheets of plants that grow in Alaska that you're welcome to pick up at the back if you haven't already got one. But some Alaskan plants that are known for having a lot of antioxidants are listed here. There are a number of berries, a number of herbs, and some trees, fir needles, and willow leaves and willow bark have a high antioxidant load, and you can consume these. Don't go chewing the willow bark because it's not really very tasty, but for the fir needles and the willow bark, and that you actually can make a tea out of. But what I provided on that list is a a listing of plants, and I stuck with the ones that seemed easily accessible. Like, it's no good for me to give you some plants that could have health benefits if they're really hard to access and you have to go through a lot of complex steps to prepare them before you can reap the benefit. So what I've made up a list of are plants that you can put in salads or use to make tea, and then you can access the goodness of them. And for many of them, that goodness is derived from antioxidants and from helping your cells to avoid or maybe reverse some of this oxidation damage.
And again, many of those processes are probably traditional, as you said earlier.
Yes, yes. Labrador tea is a very common tea beverage that's brewed by Alaska Natives. I've heard about it from a number of individuals. And so brewing tea from natural plants is quite a traditional process or traditional way to consume these. And then I just figured there's nothing easier than throwing something in a salad, so I might be imposing my own laziness on the list at that point. So what fixes cellular and molecular damage? I mean, we talked about this calorie restriction. We didn't like the idea of skipping the ice cream after the talks, but maybe we can consume some antioxidants and still have our ice cream. But it's not just the reactive oxygen species, the oxidation that's the culprit. We don't have to pin all our hopes and dreams of anti-aging on antioxidants. Because when researchers repeated these studies with mice and caloric restriction and lifespan extension, what they noticed was, mice calorically restricted have an increased lifespan, but when they sampled tissues, sampled blood, and really looked at what was going on at a cellular level, they found that in addition to a decrease in reactive oxygen species, there were a lot of internal cell signaling pathways that seem to be upregulated during this caloric restriction. And so the aging research world sunk their claws into this and said, all right, let's see if we can identify some signaling pathways that are controlling cellular function that we can tap into, manipulate, and in that way avoid or reduce cellular and molecular damage. And so this was first identified by people who were trying to get deeper into the story about mice and caloric restriction. But nobody really cares how long mice live, okay? What we really care about is how long people live. The problem with doing these kinds of experiments on people, apart from the fact that it's not ethical, is that we're a much longer-lived species than mice, and so it takes a very long time to get the data, and people are not very cooperative about letting you do all the invasive techniques that let you look at the intracellular workings of these things. So what we could do, though, is some caloric, and when I say we, I talk about the community. I've never done any of this particular research. I should be careful that I don't overstate myself. When they did some of the caloric restriction studies with people, they noticed some physiological changes that were compatible with the idea that lifespan extension would occur in humans, but they also did notice some of the same upregulation of these particular signaling pathways. So these are ways of passing messages from the external surface of the cell down into the cell and effecting a change in cellular function based on this message, this information that's coming in. So we really want to understand this. And so what we need is a research model, a research organism that we can manipulate at a cellular level. So the mice are good, but there's something even better. And it's a worm called C. elegans. And caloric restriction extends its lifespan. And we also have evidence that the same signaling pathways are involved. So C. elegans, that stands for Caenorhabditis elegans. This is the elegant worm. It got that name before they started doing research on it because they realized it has tremendous advantages as a research organism. So in that respect, it's elegant, but it got the name first, so I don't know why it got the name. Because it's really not all that elegant. It's a little worm. It's about as long as a dime is thick, but it's wonderful for aging research because it has a very short lifespan, very short generation time. After these worms hatch out, after about 3 days, they are reproductively mature. They produce massive numbers of offspring, and those offspring all have a lifespan of about 14 days. So what that means to a researcher is lots of data fast, and that is happiness for a researcher. There also is quite a list of benefits of using the worms as an animal model, and I'll run through them as I let this little video play. They have invariant growth. Every adult worm has 959 cells that develop by the same process, are in the same location worm to worm, and perform the same function worm to worm. And they are transparent, which is a good thing, because what that means is that when we apply our genetic tools, and they're tremendously amenable to our genetic tools, we can manipulate their genome. If we can manipulate their genome, we can manipulate what goes on inside the cell. And when we've manipulated the genome, when we've tweaked their gene, we can put a fluorescent tag on that, and because it's transparent, then we can see them. And that's why we see the happy face at the end here. I'm not going to play it again. But these worms are the result of a genetic manipulation that makes them be attracted to certain chemicals. And that's how they get these worms to crawl around and form this happy face. Okay? So we made the worms fluorescent, and okay. So they are an elegant worm. Go away now. You can really go away now. Because of this transparency, this wonderful fluorescent tagging that we can do. So, can we use these worms to manipulate those signaling pathways? Can we use the advantages of this worm and get in and manipulate those signaling pathways so that we can avoid damage or remove the damaged parts? And I haven't talked a lot about removing the damaged parts yet, but I'll just remind you whose job that is in the cell. It's the job of proteasomes, which you can think of as being like the garburator. Okay, they just grind up proteins, breaking them back down into amino acids that can be built into proteins again, or these lysosomes, which you can think of as being like an incinerator. Whatever you throw in there just gets reduced to nothing and it's destroyed. But this is the garbage disposal mechanisms that cells have. Can we dial up the frequency so that instead of deferred maintenance, we have adequate maintenance, adequate removal of damaged parts. Because the cell is a machine full of moving parts, and moving parts get damaged and have to be replaced. And when they have to be replaced, we need to remove them. If we don't, they hang around in the cell and gum up the works. So what kind of signaling pathway tells the cell, hey, I want you to tell the proteasome to work, spin a little faster, grind things up a little faster. I want you to get that lysosome to engulf more things and get rid of them a little faster. Well, there are a few signaling pathways that we've become very interested in. I want to walk you through them here. They all start with an external cellular signal. Okay, in some cases, it's just a passage of time, aging. Insulin is one of the signaling pathways. You're familiar with insulin. You equate it with regulation of blood sugar. But insulin does so much more for your cells and for your body. It really is a conductor that's managing this whole orchestra of players that are contributing to metabolism. Okay, so insulin is a signaling, the external signal that touches off an internal signaling pathway that modulates all of metabolism. It's not just about getting sugar into the cell. Stress, okay? Heat stress, cold stress, some of that UV light, some of that radiation, oxidative stress, any of these things that kind of challenge the cell. They activate a signaling pathway that's related to that activated by insulin and aging. So when we activate those pathways, what we're doing is turning on a series of proteins, and it's like the grapevine game. Okay, the proteins just move down. When one appears, it interacts with another one, and that transmits the information. And that goes on and interacts with the next one, and that transmits the information. And sometimes that goes on and interacts with two molecules, and that's how we get integration of signaling pathways. So we have these internal signaling pathways that are made up of a cascade of proteins. And they end at a protein that's called a transcription signal. And that's just a specialized protein that goes into the nucleus of the cell, attaches to the DNA, and turns genes on. And when genes are turned on, proteins are made. Okay? And some of the proteins that we're interested in that come from stimulating these pathways are proteins called chaperones. They make sure that other proteins get folded in the right way. Metabolic enzymes, okay? Antioxidants, okay? When those proteins are made, good things happen, okay? The proteasome works fast enough to get rid of the damaged parts, and aging is staved off. We've got proteins in balance. We don't have a buildup of dysfunctional proteins, but we're not getting rid of proteins so quickly that we're wasting useful proteins. So this is a cascade from external signals to anti-aging, to good things happen. And any breakdown in this cascade is the same thing as bad things happening, aging. So we want to look at this cascade. If we look at these signaling cascades using our worm model, we find that if we interfere with the production of these protein signals with a treatment called interference RNA, if we interfere with that production, we influence lifespan. But depending which one of those protein signals, and here's just 4 of them selected from the insulin signaling pathway, if you interfere with the production of 3 of them, you get a decrease in lifespan. So that means that when you've got enough of those, lifespan is longer. So those are good. Okay? But here's another signal within that pathway that when we reduce its protein number, lifespan is extended. So this is a protein that actually has a negative effect on lifespan. And yet they're all part of the same signaling cascade. So what we find out is it's not going to be so simple as to simply turn up or turn down an entire signaling pathway. We're going to have to get in and tweak the pathway a little bit. But we've got the right model to explore that. However, I'm a neuroscientist, and I am not satisfied just looking at lifespan. I want to look at neurons. And so we have done this using our worm model, and what we've found is that aging leads to some shape abnormalities in neurons. And what we have at the top is a normally shaped neuron. It's got one cell body and one process coming out. And some of the abnormalities we see in aging neurons is that they'll have multiple processes coming out of that cell soma, that cell body. They'll have branches coming off processes. They'll have thickenings along processes. Those are called punctae. Or they'll have these very unusually shaped cell bodies. And those abnormalities of shape are associated with aggregation of dysfunctional proteins. So what we have here is the neuron that's labeled with a green fluorescent protein. We have the protein aggregates, okay, when dysfunctional proteins accumulate in the cell, they aggregate together. So the aggregates are stained with this blue fluorescent protein, and when we do the overlay, we see that the puncta, the thickenings we see on this one, or this soma that has an abnormal number of branches, those are locations of these protein aggregations. And what we have in our lab are some strains of these worms that have been genetically modified so that they produce the proteins that aggregate and are associated with Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's disease, and Parkinson's disease. So we're looking at a model of these major neurodegenerative diseases, and what we want to know is, can we dial up some of these signaling pathways and get these cells to clear out these protein aggregates, because that is tantamount to staving off the aging process. So how do we do that? Well, we try a lot of different plant extracts, and here is an example of the plant extract quercetin, something that you find a lot of in apples, but it's also in blueberries. It's a flavonoid, so it's an antioxidant, but it's also an adaptogen. Okay, it's something that is active. They're pharmacologically active compounds that increase resistance to stress. Okay, how do they do that? Because that might be at the heart of the aging process. So what we see here is that the worms fed with quercetin have this bumping out to the right of their lifespan, but there's another interesting aspect to this. The vehicle, the chemical that we use to carry the quercetin into the worm's body is something called DMSO. Okay, and DMSO actually has a lifespan extending effect, because this is the lifespan line for control worms that don't have any kind of treatment. Now, DMSO is a toxin. At high concentrations, it is very bad for you. But it has been used for decades in very low concentration as a therapeutic by veterinarians. They use it like as a muscle liniment or rub for horses. But it has a few other odd medicinal advantages. And there what we're talking about is a strange thing that happens. It's called hormesis. And it basically says that if you have this toxic compound, at very high doses it will be toxic, but at very low doses it may actually have a health benefit. And so that's what's being shown here in this graph of hormesis. We've got the detrimental zone there, the beneficial zone up there. And as we increase dose, we cycle through this peak of benefit and then move into the toxicity. But there's a wide range over which we can derive some benefit from consuming what actually is a toxin. And plants make a lot of toxins because they're trying to discourage the herbivores from eating them. So a lot of plant adaptogens might actually be these toxins that are beneficial in low concentration. And maybe they're beneficial because they kind of tweak our stress signaling pathway just enough to accelerate the turnover of proteins. That is a theory that we're working on now. And so I separated out on the back of your sheet the plants that are high or best known for their antioxidant, those that are best known for their adaptogen content. So there are the adaptogens, but now I want to tell you what I think makes for a really good anti-aging botanical. Okay? I think it needs to be something for which we have empirical evidence that it's effective. I think we need to have some scientific studies, some data to back up that this is beneficial. I think we need to have an understanding of the mechanism by which it works. Okay? And maybe that's my bias. I really like to know how things work. Okay? I want to know what signaling pathway and what signaling molecules. But I think the key to being a good anti-aging botanical is accessibility. It needs to be easy to find. You need to be able to just walk into the nearest field, pick it, throw it in your salad, eat it, and reap the benefits. So, what are my recommended botanicals? Well, first of all, the blueberry. Okay? There's plenty of empirical evidence, and I'm sure you all knew that I would mention blueberries. We have evidence that blueberry extract extends the lifespan of our worms. So if we give them in these higher concentrations, didn't matter which concentration we gave them, extend their lifespan. Okay, so we have some of the empirical evidence and then accessibility of blueberries. Well, we can go out and pick wild bog blueberries anywhere around here. But it's interesting, 100 years ago, we didn't have any blueberry cultivation. We didn't know how to do it. Frederick Colville with the USDA actually worked out how we could cultivate blueberries. And then 100 years later, in roughly in the early 2000s, we started to get the evidence that blueberry extract actually has the effect of reversing Alzheimer's and overcoming a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's disease. And there was a very well-known researcher from Tufts, James Joseph, a neuroscientist, who in one of his reviews said, when it comes to brain protection, there's nothing quite like blueberries. Call the blueberry the brainberry. And they are marketed under that name in the Pacific Northwest. But those are Oregon blueberries, and they are nowhere near as good as the blueberries you have. And that has been scientifically shown, that there's a higher antioxidant load and a higher load of adaptogens in our wild blueberries in Alaska than anywhere else in the world. So even though it's very easy to buy blueberries at the grocery store, they're very accessible, it's well worth it to go out and pick the Alaskan ones. But accessibility is the key. So if it's a choice between no blueberries and the grocery store blueberries, go for the grocery store blueberries. Okay? Roseroot is another plant that we have a lot of scientific studies to back up its anti-aging effects. And some of those studies have been done in C. elegans, and we're embarking on some of these studies here at UAF. And what this shows is that different concentrations of extract from roseroot, the rhodiola plant, have an effect on C. elegans' lifespan. But this is sort of a hormesis type effect, because the control is the open circles right here, and you'll see that we don't get much of an effect from, well, let's just say, when we, at the lower concentrations, that's where we see the lifespan extension. But at the higher concentrations, that benefit is being negated, and at the very highest concentration, rhodiola is detrimental. Okay? That's not a concentration, you couldn't reach that by eating rhodiola. Because of the size of the C. elegans and the way we can culture them, we can overdose them on rhodiola. You don't have to worry about that, okay? But we like to know that they have that hormetic effect, that toxicity and benefit, because it gives us some insight into the signaling pathway. And we actually have been able to confirm that it is the insulin signaling pathway. Here's the DAF16 transcription factor. That was just one of those transcription factors that I mentioned when I walked you through those signaling pathways. All that this is showing is that when these worms are given the rhodiola extract, that transcription factor moves into the nucleus, binds to the DNA, and genes are being turned on. You get the highest translocation into the nucleus at the highest concentration. But remember the slide before, that's not necessarily a good thing. So turning on too many genes or turning the gene on too much, I'm not sure how you turn something on too much, but you know what I mean, too high a volume, is not good for us. What about the accessibility of roseroot? How many people had heard of roseroot before tonight? No? It's starting to appear in health food stores, but the Alaska Grown Consortium of farmers here in the state are supporting an Alaskan rhodiola product group, and this map shows current Alaska rhodiola product growers and places where it's good rhodiola country. So you can actually just go over to Delta and buy this commercially, or you can go to the grower and buy the seeds and grow it in your own garden. I have to tell you, though, it's not going to do all that great in your garden here in Fairbanks. This is a plant that likes to live at higher elevations. So,
Is it in the wild?
yes.
So
yes.
where would it be in the wild that you can get it?
You would be able to get it if you got to higher elevations in any of the mountain ranges. I think maybe if you were hiking at Angel Rocks, maybe you'd hit some elevation that was high enough, but, Fairbanks in general, not going to grow well here. But you can get the seeds and try.
Is it a salad or a tea or how do you?
So what you do with these is you take the tenderest of the roots and just throw them into a salad. You can also make a tea, the tenderest of the leaves, so the newest leaves, and just put those into salad. And the root can be crushed a bit and steeped as a tea.
Is there any evidence of any of this stuff that you're on your list of allergic reactions to any of this stuff?
So, absolutely anything in very high concentration can provoke a reaction. You can overdo it. You can irritate the digestive system. That's not really an allergic reaction. That's too much and you've irritated it, but they're related. As far as an allergen, there's nothing specific about any of these plants different from any other plant. I mean, some of these plants disperse pollens, and pollen is bad for hay fever. So there will be some allergic reaction, but it's not going to be a catastrophic anaphylaxis kind of reaction, because we generally don't have that kind of response to plant allergens. So, rose root is accessible, and now the last of my top 3, dandelions. Who's had dandelion leaves in their salad? Yeah, lots of people. What about, who's eaten the flowers? And made, and who's had dandelion wine? So, but apparently the leaves, the flowers, very edible, very high in antioxidants, probably also have adaptogens. That's what I would like to investigate. There isn't actually any research on C. elegans yet, so maybe I can be the first one to do dandelion extract and C. elegans lifespan extension. Accessibility, I don't think we have to make a case for that. And so, what should you eat to slow aging and neurodegeneration? You should go out and feast on a salad that has blueberries, rose root, and dandelion leaves in it. Or anything else on the list. Make it clear that I chose these 3 for my own characteristics of what makes for a good anti-aging botanical, that it have scientific evidence and it be accessible. Anything on the list that I handed out is an Alaskan plant that has some of these health benefits. And I put bird vetch on there because I just wanted to find a way to see something good about that plant. Yes?
Does freezing negatively impact any of these?
No. And so you'll get what freezing won't affect the chemicals that are responsible for these properties, but what freezing does is break up the tissue and break up the cells, and so you'll actually lose some of the material. So you'll get your biggest dose, your best dose, eating things fresh, but you still get plenty of benefit from using frozen blueberries in baking them into muffins. You're still eating blueberry and you're still getting that good stuff.
Can you freeze dandelions, any part of the dandelions for winter use or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my technician in the lab was telling me today that they used to deep fry batter and fry the dandelion heads, and that's the way they ate them. Now, I'm pretty sure that that's going to be a wash. But there's no reason that you couldn't, freeze them. And I have never eaten the flower. I've eaten the leaves. It's new to me that the flower has the same benefits and that the flower is eaten. But she did say that it was bitter and that they were only good for as long as the batter was good. So I don't know.
Have you looked at high bush cranberries?
High bush cranberry has some definite health benefits. It actually, they tell you to drink cranberry juice to ward off urinary tract infections. That's because there's a particular kind of sugar molecule made by the cranberry that prevents bacteria from sticking to the walls of the urinary tract. And so that's an actual mechanism we can understand. What I didn't have was any real clear evidence of an adaptogen kind of function, and so I didn't include it on my list. But if my list is in my opinion, and you are encouraged to seek out the opinions of others, and there are many good books. My graduate student actually picked this one up at Gulliver's, and then I stole it from her. I have to give it back. But high bush cranberry is definitely mentioned in here, and there are medicinal benefits. But when I read through, what I didn't see was the clear antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, adaptogen. Oftentimes the adaptogen hint is if they say it's a stimulant or a tonic. That often then what's being stimulated is the stress response. They're just giving it a slight stimulation. And adaptogens work as stimulants in a way that's completely different from other kinds of drug stimulants. Yep.
Early in my garden season, I go through a huge crop of what I call limestone. And when it's picked and cooked, it's just like a delicious finish.
Oh.
I was wondering if there was any research done on it, meaning hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these.
All right. I'm not familiar with that plant, but my curiosity is piqued. Somebody.
Oh, man.
Okay. I'll check that one out. Put it in the hopper right after my dandelions.
What about birdcatch? I love to eat it. What do you do? Just throw it in the salad?
Peas in the salad, yeah.
What about the flowers?
I'm always leery about eating the flowers, but if you can eat the dandelion flower, I don't see why you couldn't eat the bird. And then I know there are many flowers that are good, like nasturtiums are an edible flower. So it may just be what we call honeysuckle, where I grew up as a flower of a tree. Pardon?
Can you eat the rose-hip roses?
Yes.
So anything you experiment with, though, is your own choice. And my only advice to you is try it in a small concentration first. Because if it's toxic, you'll, just your lips will tingle at first. No, there won't be. Yeah, I've heard of that. What I wonder about that is it derived from the color pigment? Because very often it's the color pigments in plants, and that Jim Joseph that I talked about when I mentioned the blueberries, he actually had a whole guide to choosing good plants to eat based on their color. And things that are in get into the purple pigments, which if you have a very dark rose, you would be getting into the purple. Even if it looks pink, there's a number of different pigments in there. But So that's what I wonder when I hear about the use of petals. They're the colored parts of the plant.
But isn't that like plants, isn't that their mechanism, the brighter color, the more poisonous they can be for like other bugs and things like that? I mean...
No, there's, now that I think about
Don't
it.
you have to be careful of brightly colored things also?
I think that's more berries than flowers, because when I think about it now, I probably shouldn't have the bias against flowers that I have, because the nectar that they have is a sugar solution. They want insects to come and take that and take away a load of pollen as well. The colors are usually to attract insects. There's warning coloration in nature. I mean, bees and wasps are black and yellow because that's a warning to us. And the only thing I've heard about colors, like certain colors of berries, that they tell you to avoid. But I don't think there's any
I'm just curious.
guarantee.
Pardon me?
Mushrooms, the red,
Yeah, don't eat the red mushrooms. Don't eat the red mushrooms with spots. But bringing up mushrooms is interesting because there's a shelf mushroom that grows on birch trees. It's called chaga. It's a big shelf mushroom. That has the highest antioxidant load that's ever been found that's ever been found in plants. And Alaska natives and natives in Russia make a tea out of that.
So it's safe to eat then?
To get that.
So it's safe to use that?
Yes.
I'm afraid of if I don't know mushroom, then I don't even dare.
And I think that's a wise move. But so Gary Larson is the mushroom man that we have here, and I specifically made him show me chaga so I could make sure I got the right thing, and made him assure me that, yes, I could make tea from that, and it would be good. And that is one that we are investigating with our C. elegans, our worm model, but I didn't take today's talk down into the mushrooms because they get a bit scary.
I have read that the highest antioxidant is in fact a kernel of popcorn. Is that valid?
I'm skeptical of that, but I would be happy to consult the source of all knowledge. No, I'll actually, I will. I'll go home and find out. That doesn't do you any good right now, but
Call him at 3 in the morning.
I'm skeptical, but I don't know the answer. Pardon me?
I think it's GMO corn.
There's a lot of misinformation about genetically modified organisms, and we shouldn't have a knee-jerk response rejection of them. But I completely understand any skepticism about something that we've manipulated and altered. But
We just want to know, we just want the information, just like knowing that our emails are being tracked or phone calls are being tracked or that our food is being modified.
yeah,
That's all we ask.
yeah, I think that's I'm with you on that. Yeah, tell me the facts and let me make my own choice. I agree completely.
I just have a question about the C. elegans. You said its length is that of a dime.
The thickness,
Is it all done with electron microscope?
No, just a dissecting microscope. Actually, you can do it with a hand lens. We just hosted some people in the lab from a colleague's lab in Rutgers, and they were specifically designing screens for plants that would have beneficial characteristics using C. elegans, but screenings that could be done in the field. So everything had to be, put it in your backpack and go. So they can be seen, and even you can hit the fluorescence with a little pen laser and see. But we in the lab do the bulk of our work looking at them through just dissecting microscopes. And then when we want to really count those aberrations, when we neuroscientists get in and want to look at aberrations of neurons or protein aggregates, then we're off to a compound microscope. But we don't have to go to a electron. No.
Have you done the cloudberries? I didn't see it. The cloudberries.
It's in the book. But again, when I read through and just took my educated guess, did I see indication of antioxidant, anti-inflammatory? The question was about cloudberry. It's definitely in the books. Oh, wait a minute.
You have a lot of money.
Salmonberry.
No,
Are they?
Cloudberries are mostly out in the tundra. I know. Salmonberries are like
On the coast.
higher
Yeah.
bush.
I think that the book equates the two of them. But I suspect, so I have salmonberry on the list. And so I believe that they would have a similar beneficial property as the salmonberry, because they're not the same. I take you at your word. You're knowledgeable about that than I am. But they are related plants, and so we can make an assumption that they'll have some of the same beneficial properties.
If they're friendly, no prior.
Yes?
It's, as far as I know, it's not a native plant to Alaska. I know it grows all over the place, and so many people have it in their gardens. What about rhubarb?
Yes.
Rhubarb is fantastic. Yeah, rhubarb has wonderful antioxidant and adaptogen properties in it. I didn't include it on my list because I was trying to stick to Alaskan plants, although I put the bird vetch in, that was perfect for, It's an invasive species, but it's kind of, it's fun to think that we might reap some benefit from it. But if I were going to make a list of just, the yummiest things you can eat that are good for you, rhubarb is going to be way high on my list. Yeah.
What part of the birch?
Bark, and bark of sort of more tender shoots. That's where you'll. Not as much. Yeah, leaves will have some as well, but really the buds, because I think what we're where the branch is extending, the growth branch, and I think really what we're getting at there is the plant's defenses against herbivores that come and graze on it, because they all think that's the best bit of the plant because it has the least fiber in it, it's the tenderest, and so herbivores go after that. So what plants do in response, not that they think about it much, but what plants do in response is they pack those growing shoots with the bitter, the toxins that they have, and those are very often the source of our adaptogens, so things that are going to tweak our signaling pathways.
So how would you make a tea with that?
Crush it and steep it. Yep.
What about Alaska rose hips?
Rose hips are well known for they have lots of vitamin C, but also for antioxidant. I don't know offhand about adaptogen type properties, but I guess I didn't think of that I didn't equate that with being an Alaskan plant. But yeah, So I should have put it on the list.
I appreciate the focus on the Alaskan stuff, but environmental backgrounds asks this question. Have comparable studies been done at other latitudes? Or is there something in the northern environment that stresses plants in such a way that they produce more of these?
That's a fantastic question, thank you, because I hadn't touched on this. Absolutely. In plants that grow in the Arctic and the subarctic, they get a much higher load of these good chemicals, antioxidants and adaptogens. And most people attribute that to the fact that we have such a short growing season. The plants have to have such a high growth rate, such a high metabolic rate, that and the predation pressure everything is amped up. And so it's not about surviving a long cold winter. It's about doing well in that very short, intense summer. But plants at the high northern latitudes will always, I'm a little biased, will mostly outperform a similar plant from the lower latitudes. There ought to be some benefit to living up here in the long, dark, cold. So that's what it is.
I think Ariel would like to serve you ice cream.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for joining us this evening, and thank you everybody for coming out. We do have free ice cream outside for everybody to enjoy. And if you'd actually like to review this lecture, we will be putting it up on the Summer Sessions website. We will have it up by Monday. And our website is uaf.edu/summer.
Okay, great.
All right.
Thank you.
I enjoyed that.
Thank you.
My family we have an advantage of looking younger. We take care of ourselves, right? I have a sister who's 3.5 years older than me, but she smoked and drank a lot. So we went on vacation together, and I thought she was one of my kids, Harrison, right? But I know we have the gene and just healthy living.
That's right. Well, you do have the gene.
Well, but not just that, I mean holistic health too. So just different things with that. And then our cultural, because I'm a mix of 3 native tribes, and then African, those cultural things, they call it home remedies, grown food, etc. So I am so happy to get this. I don't know what to do.
Wonderful.
Where are you from?
Wonderful.
Here. Oh, okay. Because from some of the things you said, I thought, did she come up from someplace else?
No, I'm a professor here. Grew up in Canada.
Okay, cool.
I'm here. Yeah, and I would love to learn more about these remedies that people are using, and because I think one of the ways we can get them more mainstream and get people actually, I'm a UAF employee. Do you still think I need it? I think when you're faculty, they own your image. So I don't think you need it, but I am happy to sign it because we don't want any problems.
And staying hydrated, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
This company right here, I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yes.
Okay. The oxidative stress and you've heard of them, but their nutritionist, Dr. Wentz, he's big into that. And they explain all that. One thing I loved about it is the way they would educate us with how their nutritionals work to deal with oxidative stress and the free radicals. And I talk to people
Yeah,
about
'cause
that
I think
all the time.
the way we can make this more mainstream for all the population is if I think there's so much truth and so much benefit in some of these home remedies, folk remedies, and if we can validate them, maybe we can get over that hump and get them accepted as mainstream. So
That's what I want to do.
I don't think
too.
everything always has to be validated by science. That's not my point. But if it helps somebody use it, then great. I'd be happy to do that research.
Oh, really?
So.
Okay. Well, you're on the website. You can faculty.
Yep.
Okay.
I have a business card here. This is you?
That's me.
I'll email you, and then you'll have my email.
Cool. Thank you.
Sure. I just wanted to thank you for a really excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
As a retired ecologist, I had to ask that question.
No! Thank goodness you did, because I'd forgotten a key part of my repertoire.
Yeah, it just seemed like it just had to have some relevance.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, so this is the board.
I know that you're doing all plant stuff. I was wondering about salmon.
So then what we're
Does
getting...
that have antioxidant in salmon?
Well, thank you. It does, but their
as
cells
much?
don't have any more than your cells already do.
Oh.
Because if this plant's got special extra endowment of it.
Oh.
And maybe it has to do with being sedentary or, I don't know. We'd have to, brainstorm about that for a while. But there certainly are unique fatty acids and other types of molecules that might be found in certain foods, especially wild foods. As we domesticate things, we unfortunately breed a lot of the goodness out of them. But so the biggest thing with salmon is the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids.
So that's not really the anti-aging, but it's for other building your cells.
No, I can make a link because when cell membranes get oxidized, we need to rebuild them. And certain parts of the cell membrane, it's a fluid mosaic, and some parts are, like the parts around a receptor, have to have more mobility to them, and other parts of the cell need a little bit more rigidity. Well, that's all done with different types of fatty acids, and so where you need that more fluidity is what you need omega-3s and omega-6s for. And so if you're consuming them in your diet, then as your body is making new cells, those new cells are going to have good membranes as opposed to membranes that don't quite have the fluidity in certain areas that they're supposed to have. And the cell membrane, some of those fatty acids that make up the cell membrane actually get broken apart, and components of them become part of those signaling pathways. So everything
It's amazing how we're made and put together.
Yeah, it's the most integrated, which makes it a challenge to pull it apart, but just wonderfully fun, and it just leaves you in such awe of
creation.
Exactly. So,
but a wise creator.
So yes, we do.
Let's put it together.
But there are a lot of food-derived beneficial chemicals that I could talk about from other standpoints. I wanted to really hit the note of Alaska and
I appreciate that.
And the anti-aging, in a way that I could explain it in time, in the allotted time. Because I wanted to be sure I could tell the whole story.
So now,
it's terrible to tell half the story.
Right. And it was very interesting and very informative.
Oh, thank you.
So we drink the tea, so it goes in us. And I'm thinking about my garden. And I'm growing kale this year. My friend made kale chips, and it was amazing. And then I saw them in the health food store, and they're really expensive. It's like, oh, I'm going to make these. But I don't want to fertilize my garden with like the blue fertilizer I use for my flowers. I want something healthy. But it'd be good, and we just got salmon. My husband just got back, and so we put the salmon water, because we fish fertilizer. And he buried some of the eggs and a couple heads and stuff, but we have neighborhood cats.
And they're happily digging it all up